The American flag on Arctic ice, Greenland in the crosshairs. Who would have thought that a frozen, sparsely populated island at the edge of the world could rattle the nerves of Washington and shake the unity of NATO? And yet, in 2025, Greenland, a land of glaciers and silence, suddenly became the focal point of one of the most high-stakes geopolitical gambits in modern history. And leading that charge was none other than Donald Trump, the man who once said, "Greenland is a strategic asset the United States must have, at any cost." It all began like a political thunderstorm. Fresh off his re-election victory in November 2024, Trump wasted no time reigniting old ambitions. In tweets, fiery speeches, and closed-door meetings, he brought back an idea many thought had been buried in 2019, absorbing Greenland into the United States. But this time, it wasn't just a trial balloon. It was a declaration of intent. One way or another, we're going to get Greenland, he said with typical bravado. And this time, no one was laughing. By early 2025, the National Security Council began dusting off Cold War-era documents. Hidden in dusty Pentagon vaults were strategic memos from the Eisenhower and Reagan administrations, plans for securing the Arctic Gap, upgrading radar networks around the North Pole, and contingency operations involving the U.S. airbase in Thule, northern Greenland. Suddenly, these forgotten files became the blueprint for something far more ambitious, a renewed American claim over the icy island. But why Greenland? The answer lay beneath the ice. Greenland holds a staggering amount of untapped wealth, more than 38 billion tons of rare earth minerals. According to geological estimates, these include essential elements like niobium, graphite, and zirconium, critical for everything from fighter jets and hypersonic missiles to EV batteries and smartphones. Add to that an estimated 17 billion barrels of oil and vast reserves of natural gas. And Greenland becomes far more than a frozen wilderness. It becomes one of the richest undeveloped resource frontiers on Earth. Trump understood this, and more importantly, he framed it not just as an economic opportunity, but a matter of national security. Pentagon analysts pointed to a troubling radar blind spot near Greenland's northern coast, one that Russian submarines could exploit. This is not just about minerals, Trump said in one press conference. This is about defending America. Greenland is the key. The tone shifted from negotiation to ownership. In March 2025, Trump stood before Congress and dropped all pretense of diplomacy. The United States, he declared, should take control of Greenland outright, for its own good and for ours. He wasn't asking anymore, he was asserting. Greenland, in his vision, was no longer up for debate. But Washington was not alone in this game. Across the Atlantic, rage was boiling. In Copenhagen, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called Trump's remarks arrogant and imperial. In Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, leaders were even more blunt. "We are not property," said one Greenlandic official. "We are people, and we decide our future." The blowback was swift and fierce. Greenland may be part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but it enjoys broad autonomy. And in this moment, it used that autonomy to draw a line. Together, Denmark and Greenland issued a rare joint statement. Any attempt to force or coerce Greenland into changing its status would be considered an attack on the sovereignty of both nations, and a threat to the unity of NATO itself. For the first time in modern history, a small Arctic territory and its European protector were openly defying the demands of a superpower, and doing it with unshakable clarity. Meanwhile, as the headlines roared and Washington doubled down, something far more subtle was taking place. A quiet masterstroke was unfolding far from the cameras and microphones. A move so calculated, so unexpected, that it would soon turn this Arctic standoff on its head. But before we reveal that twist, it's essential to understand one truth. Greenland was no longer a remote outpost. It had become the board on which a new Cold War was being played, and this time, the pawns were moving faster than the kings. NATO cracks and Canada strikes, the Arctic alliance reimagined, as President Trump doubled down on his vision of American sovereignty over Greenland. The reverberations spread far beyond Copenhagen and Nuuk. The confrontation wasn't just a bilateral dispute anymore. It was beginning to unravel the delicate fabric of NATO itself. Allies who once stood united against common threats suddenly found themselves divided over a frozen island. A fractured NATO front. Norway, itself an Arctic nation with deep ties to Denmark, was the first to break the silence. In an unusually blunt statement, Oslo warned that any attempt to pressure Denmark or Greenland into territorial concessions would be viewed as an attack on all of us. Norwegian intelligence quietly began sharing Arctic surveillance data with Denmark and Greenland, signaling a level of military coordination that had not been seen in years. France, though not an Arctic player by geography, chose a bold show of solidarity. The French Navy dispatched a nuclear-powered submarine to patrol the waters of Baffin Bay, the sea that separates Greenland from Canada. It was a symbolic maneuver, but its message was unmistakable. Europe was watching, and it was not impressed with Washington's tactics. At the same time, Paris pledged economic support for Greenland's development, including investments in a long-awaited international airport. This wasn't just charity, it was strategy. By helping build Greenland's infrastructure, France and its EU partners were offering something Washington hadn't: respect, partnership, and long-term economic development. Poland, on the other hand, stayed silent. A close U.S. defense partner, Warsaw was clearly caught in a geopolitical tug-of-war. Analysts suggested that Poland's silence was a calculated move, not to anger its American patron, while avoiding alienating its European allies. It was a balancing act in a diplomatic minefield. Canada, however, was about to change the game entirely. The Canadian curveball. While Trump tweeted and European leaders made headlines, Canada was quietly executing one of the most effective geopolitical maneuvers in recent Arctic history. Rather than stake territorial claims or issue ultimatums, Canada approached Greenland with a different proposition: real partnership. As early as 2023, Canadian mining companies began laying the groundwork. They were targeting Greenland's rich mineral deposits, not through conquest, but through cooperation. By early 2025, those efforts culminated in a groundbreaking $3 billion investment deal involving Greenland's government, Canadian firms, European development banks, and even some discreet U.S. investors. At the heart of the deal was a Canadian company called Greenland Resources Inc., which secured a 30-year license to mine molybdenum, a metal vital for high-strength steel used in everything from skyscrapers to submarines. The backing came not just from private capital, but also from Denmark's Export Credit Agency and the European Investment Bank's Green Fund. The ore would be extracted in Greenland, refined in Europe, and integrated directly into EU supply chains. And the United States? Nowhere in sight. Another Canadian company, Amaroq Minerals, pulled off a similar coup, focused on a stalled gold and silver project in southern Greenland. Amaroq secured more than £60 million in funding. The list of backers read like a who's who of global finance: Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund, Denmark's State Investment Fund, UK investors, and yes, even some American capital chasing returns despite Washington's aggressive rhetoric. While the White House was saber-rattling, Wall Street was placing bets on Canada. What made Canada's approach so effective wasn't just money, it was diplomacy. These were not takeovers, they were joint ventures, structured to ensure Greenland retained control over its own resources. The message to Nuuk was clear: we're not here to buy you. We're here to build with you. Washington stunned. By the time the news broke, it was too late. In just a few months, Canada and its partners had secured long-term economic influence over Greenland without firing a single shot, without offending a single ally, and without disrupting a single NATO protocol. Washington was blindsided. Behind closed doors, national security officials scrambled to understand what had just happened. They had been so focused on asserting dominance that they missed the soft power revolution unfolding beneath their feet. Greenland's leaders, who had long asked for investment and infrastructure, not annexation, had found their answer. And it didn't come wrapped in an American flag. The implications were immediate. American defense contractors began to panic. Greenland's rare earth elements and strategic minerals were now earmarked for Europe. The ripple effects hit everything from missile production to smartphone factories. Suddenly, Washington was no longer just unwelcome in Greenland, it was irrelevant. In Congress, frustration turned to backlash. Moderate Republicans and Democrats alike began questioning the administration's heavy-handed tactics. Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, a prominent voice on Arctic policy, warned that Trump's approach was not only counterproductive but alienating to the very allies we rely on. And she was right. What could have been a collaborative effort to secure the Arctic had turned into a diplomatic embarrassment and a lost opportunity. The ice breaks, aftershocks, autonomy, and a new Arctic order. By the summer of 2025, what had started as an aggressive bid by the United States to claim Greenland had evolved into something far more complex and far less favorable for Washington. The dream of hoisting the American flag over Greenland's ice-covered peaks was no longer just improbable. It had become diplomatically toxic. But for Greenland, this geopolitical storm had an unexpected effect. It elevated the island from a passive piece on the global chessboard to a power broker in its own right. The Arctic turns away from Washington, with Canada, Denmark, and the European Union securing multi-billion-dollar mining rights and development deals. Greenland had firmly pivoted toward cooperation with like-minded partners. These weren't just business deals, they were a rejection of Washington's approach. In the United States, the consequences hit quickly and hard. Defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon found themselves scrambling for alternatives. Molybdenum from Greenland, crucial for producing high-strength alloys used in fighter jets, tanks, and hypersonic missiles, was now flowing to Europe. Some testing programs were quietly delayed, as access to specialized materials grew uncertain. Reports emerged of Raytheon expanding procurement efforts in Chile and Australia, desperately seeking new sources. And the fallout wasn't limited to defense. The U.S. tech and clean energy sectors were also affected. Under the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, American companies were promised major tax incentives for producing electric vehicles and clean energy infrastructure, if their components were made domestically or sourced from trusted partners. Greenland had been a potential linchpin in that supply chain. Not anymore. With Greenland's mineral output being locked into European markets, American battery producers and wind turbine manufacturers saw raw material prices spike. Risk levels rose, deadlines slipped, and as a result, the very green transition the U.S. had championed was now threatened by a lack of critical resources. Ironically, Trump's America First approach to Greenland had backfired so thoroughly that it left America last in line. Greenland's transformation. But while Washington stumbled, something extraordinary was happening in Greenland itself. For the first time in its modern history, Greenland was being courted, not claimed. Empowered by the global spotlight and a flood of investment, Greenland's leaders began to chart a bolder course for the island's future. And at the center of that course was a single, long-standing dream: independence. The Greenlandic Parliament passed sweeping new legislation aimed at ensuring that mining profits would benefit its people, not just foreign investors. Companies operating on the island were now required to hire a significant portion of their workforce from the local population and invest in public infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads. Even more significantly, the parliament created a sovereign wealth fund, modeled loosely after Norway's oil fund, designed to hold profits from resource extraction and reinvest them into Greenland's long-term development. The goal? Economic self-sufficiency. A foundation strong enough to one day remove the need for the roughly $700 million in annual subsidies provided by Denmark. With every new deal, every new job, and every newly paved road, Greenland was inching closer to something once seen as impossible: standing on its own 2 feet. A new Arctic reality. On the global stage, the implications were enormous. Greenland was no longer a silent bystander to superpower ambitions. It had become a strategic gatekeeper in the Arctic, holding minerals, alliances, and leverage that even Washington could no longer ignore. And crucially, it had redefined what power looks like in the 21st century. This wasn't about armies or aircraft carriers. It was about economic statecraft, resource diplomacy, and building real partnerships rather than flexing imperial muscle. Canada's quiet success showed that middle powers could punch far above their weight. The EU's involvement proved that cooperative frameworks could outmaneuver unilateral pressure. And Greenland itself sent a message to small nations everywhere: if you hold what others need, you hold the power. For the United States, it was a sobering moment. The world's most powerful nation had attempted a bold land gambit in the Arctic, and failed. Not because it was outmatched militarily, but because it misunderstood what Greenland truly wanted. While Trump offered ownership, others offered respect. And respect, it turns out, is what Greenland valued most. Epilogue. Lessons from the ice. As 2025 drew to a close, the Arctic chessboard looked radically different. The U.S. still held its Thule Air Base in Greenland, and Alaska remained a key part of Arctic defense. But the narrative had shifted. The Arctic was no longer a two-player game between the U.S. and Russia. It was now shaped by a coalition of smaller, smarter players working together. For Trump, the Greenland episode became a case study in overreach. For Washington's allies, it was a reminder that American power had limits. And for Greenland, it was a coming-of-age story, an emergence from obscurity into influence. Whether independence will come in 5 years or 50, one thing is clear: Greenland is no longer for sale. And more importantly, it's no longer waiting for anyone's permission to lead.